Hidden down a back road outside of San Marcos, Texas, lies one of the only body farms in the United States, the Freeman Ranch Body Farm. This 26-acre outdoor human decomposition research lab is funded by Texas State University and is currently home to about 50 donated bodies. Some of the bodies are protected by cages so that researchers can study the effects of bacterial decomposition on the body, and others are unprotected in the scalding sun so that researchers can track the effects of scavenging. It's been open since 2008, and the remains of 150 individuals have already been studied there. Another 200 still living people have pre-registered to add their bodies there for future research. This is the main gate, and we drove all the way up, but we didn't want to go inside because we didn't want to trespass. But this is the Freeman Ranch Body Farm. Also, a deer made headlines one time because someone got a picture of it chewing on a human rib here. I'd love to see inside.
So she murdered her boyfriend because he wanted to break up with her. On March 25th, 2022, Abigail White stabbed her boyfriend Bradley Lewis in the heart when he told her that he wanted to end their relationship. Abigail used a 17-centimeter kitchen knife, and when police arrived to their home, she first said that Bradley did it to himself, but then she changed her story and said that she never intended to hurt him. What's chilling about this story is that their own friends even warned them that one of them was gonna end up dead. That's how toxic their relationship was. Abigail was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison, but apparently she's having a hard time getting her needs met while she's in there. So get this, she requested conjugal visits so she can have sex behind bars. She said that prison needs to be more considerate of her needs and allow her to have overnight stays with her new boyfriend. So basically she wants the privilege of having a good time with her new man after she just finished murdering her last boyfriend.
This is Edward Theodore Gein. He was an American murderer and body snatcher active between 1954 and 1957. Gein used to visit local graveyards, dig up dead bodies, and make household items out of their skin and bones. There's some horrific photos online which show the items Gein fashioned. He made lampshades and chairs using human skin. He used skulls as bowls and ashtrays. Masks were fashioned using the faces of dead bodies. And he even made a belt out of women's nipples. TikTok won't allow me to show the photos, but they're readily available online if you're curious. Gein admitted that he killed 2 women as well. Tavern owner Mary Hogan was killed by Gein in 1954, as was hardware store owner Bernice Warden in 1957. Realistically, the number is probably much higher. His crimes led to him being known as the Butcher of Plainfield and the Plainfield Ghoul. Gein went on to inspire fictional serial killers such as Leatherface, Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill. Gein died of respiratory failure and lung cancer in 1984. This is John Wayne Gacy. He was an American serial killer and sex offender who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. Gacy regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events under the pseudonym Pogo the Clown. He dressed up in full clown makeup for such events. He was known therefore as the Killer Clown, though he never killed anyone at such an event or whilst in his clown costume. Gacy would lure his victims to his house, get them wasted, handcuff them, rape them, torture them and kill them. He would place a rope tourniquet around their neck before progressively tightening the rope with a hammer handle. Gacy would then store his victims' bodies underneath his bed for a day or two before finally burying them in the crawl space of his house. He was convicted of 1 count of sodomy, 33 counts of murder, 1 count of sexual assault and 1 count of indecent liberties with a child. He was executed by the electric chair on May 10th, 1994.
This is one of the scariest ghost stories I've heard, so now everyone's gotta hear it. Back in 2003, there was this group of deployed American Marines who got moved into abandoned military housing that was dubbed Ghost Town. It got the name because apparently the first group of Marines that lived there only made it a week before they couldn't live there anymore. They said they couldn't sleep the entire time they were there. Like all night they would hear the sounds of children laughing, of like footsteps upstairs when there was no one there. I talk about it this week on the podcast, but one night the new group that had moved in had to go out and patrol the area. So they're walking through the neighborhood, like past a bunch of abandoned houses, and then all of a sudden, one of the Marines just starts screaming. He throws his weapon down and just takes off running, like through enemy territory with no weapon. So half of the Marines chase after him, and then the other half turn around to see what he was screaming at. They said that behind them, there was this creature that looked like a shadow come to life. It was really tall and skinny, but they said it had these bright, glowing red eyes. But before they knew what to do, it just vanished. The craziest part is that multiple other people have reported seeing this exact creature like in the area. If you want to hear more of these stories, you've got to check out the podcast this week.
Minutes before Audrey Hale opened fire at the Covenant School, she messaged one of her friends to warn her. Audrey messaged Avriana Patton, who was a former basketball teammate, and told her that she was going to take her life and that something bad was going to happen. Avriana quickly called the suicide prevention hotline, but then they told her to call police. Then police told Avriana to call the non-emergency number, and at this point, it was 10:14 a.m. At 10:15 a.m., Audrey had already entered the building and opened fire. Avriana explains that no one ever came back to the phone, and she got a phone call back an hour later. Avriana had no idea that the person involved in the shooting was her friend who contacted her in the morning. It's been said that Audrey was under care for an emotional disorder, but she was still able to legally buy 7 weapons. On the morning of the shooting, Audrey was seen by her parents leaving the house with a red backpack, and they asked her what was in it, but she brushed off the question. The victims were Catherine Coons, who was the head of the school, Mike Hill, who was the school custodian, Cynthia Peak, who was a substitute teacher. The other 3 victims are 9 years old, one of them being 9-year-old Hallie Scruggs, who is actually the daughter of the pastor of the school. The other victim was William Kinney and 9-year-old Evelyn Dykehouse.
Did you know there's like a whole black market for memorabilia taken from famous true crime scenes? There was just an auction for items taken from the Murdaugh home, and it was insane. Like antlers off the wall went for $10,000. And all because that's the scene where Alec Murdaugh took the lives of his wife and son. This is a real crazy industry, so I'm going to show you some stuff that got sold in the past. Years ago, there was an auction for all of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber stuff. It included pieces from his wardrobe as well as his manifesto and the typewriter that he wrote it on. All in all, it made almost $200,000, and some of this stuff goes to museums, but a lot of it goes to private buyers. Like, it's mostly private buyers that buy John Wayne Gacy's art. So originally, a lot of Gacy's pieces were bought to be burned in a bonfire, but there's still a lot of his stuff out there. Pieces tend to go between $3,000 and $5,000, and they almost exclusively go to private buyers. Another notable one was this postcard that was potentially written by Jack the Ripper. It went for 22,000 pounds. But people will sell literally anything, like locks of Manson's hair, dirt from Gacy's basement, even teeth impressions taken by the police of the Night Stalker. Ironically, Bundy's iconic beetle was actually bought by a man who gifted it to his teenage daughter. They've tried to put laws in place in the past to prevent things like this from selling, but it continues to be a very macabre and booming market.
This woman killed her roommate over a phone charger. 26-year-old Monica Anderson was living with Lan Lee. Lan was 20 and the 2 women had been introduced through mutual friends. They'd been roommates in Sacramento for around 6 months. Now, Lan had a troubled upbringing and had struggled with addiction to substances. She'd actually been living in a group home for young women but wasn't able to stay once she turned a certain age. She met Monica just after turning 18. On the 13th of March 2010, the pair were drinking alcohol and taking substances. At around 2:30 a.m, they began arguing over a phone charger. Monica, sensing that things were escalating to a dangerous level, tried to run away. Terrifyingly, Lan chased her out of the apartment with a butcher's knife. Lan launched into a vicious attack, stabbing her 91 times. She then tried to stab herself and a friend stopped her. Police raced to the scene and arrested Lan. At the trial, prosecutors stated that Lan murdered Monica over pettiness and ridiculousness. They also played the jurors a video of Lan being questioned by police. In the video, Lan admits that she was simply angry at Monica for not giving her a phone charger. Interestingly, it wasn't the first time that things had got violent between the pair of them. Months prior, Monica actually told her parents that Lan had attacked her and given her a black eye. Lan was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life.
Okay, now this story is extremely disturbing. This pastor in Houston, Texas was just arrested recently for assaulting his own family member over 600 times. This makes this guy a hardcore pedophile. So meet Robert L. Carter. He's a 39-year-old pastor right here in Houston, Texas, where I live. And in recent court documents that were unsealed, we learned that Robert L. Carter started abusing his own family member when she was only 7 years old. So what Robert liked to do was essay this young child when all the other family members in the house were sleeping. And afterwards, he would try to bribe the child to not tell anybody about this by giving them candy. The child has now stated that Robert abused her almost daily. And when Robert would bring this girl to school, he would stop at an H-E-B store and essay her in the parking lot in the back of his car. Now, keep in mind, this entire time that all of this disgusting stuff was going on, Robert was a pastor at a local church. This was somebody that people came to for religious advice about how to live their own lives, how to be righteous. But little did they know, the entire time they were communicating with the literal devil himself. The victim even stated that Robert would actually take her to one of his churches and SA her inside of the church. And disturbingly, when the victim was 16 years old, she gave birth to her own family member's child. Now, this trial hasn't happened yet, and I don't know what's going to come out of this, but I'm hoping to God that this guy gets life in prison. This is one of the most demonic things I've ever seen on the internet. And honestly, if I could say 4 words to Robert, they would be very simple. I hope you rot.
This singer was murdered and tied up in Christmas lights. 27-year-old Egypt Covington was last seen alive at a yoga class on the 22nd of June 2017. Tragically, she would be dead the following day. Egypt was a popular musician and singer from Van Buren Township. Her dad described her as the type of person to light up a room. She was about to start living with her boyfriend Curtis Meadows. The pair had been dating on and off for about 10 years. On June the 23rd, Curtis was unable to get hold of her and he turned up at her house to see what was wrong. When he arrived, he saw her car was there, but disturbingly, her door was wide open. Worryingly, her dog was there barking in the hall. The dog was alerting Curtis to something horrific. Egypt's body was lying face down on the floor. She'd been shot in the head, behind the ear, and her hands had been bound with Christmas lights. Now, police felt that Egypt did know her killers because there was no sign of forced entry. There was strangely also no sign that anything had been stolen. It would be almost a year until a person of interest was finally announced. This was her ex-boyfriend, Kenny, who she had been with while her and Curtis were on a break. Egypt's family said that Kenny had been quite volatile and abusive. However, he wasn't charged with anything and the case went cold. That was until a break in the case in November 2020. 37-year-old Eugene Moore and 34-year-old Shane Evans were arrested. A month later, 30-year-old Shandon Groom was arrested as well. According to testimony in court, the men had accidentally broken into the wrong house. The men had intended to break into the neighbour's house and steal substances. They were recently sentenced to time in prison and each got between 15 years and 55 years.
This photo might have the most disturbing backstory. This is Travis Alexander, and this photo was taken moments before his ex-girlfriend savagely murdered him. In 2006, Travis met 26-year-old Jodi Aria at a Las Vegas conference, and Jodi was beautiful, blonde, and carefree. She was an inspiring photographer, and Travis was a salesman, motivational speaker, and a devout Mormon. When the pair met, they had an instant connection. They started dating, and despite living in different states, they continued their long-distance relationship. However, since the beginning of the relationship, Travis's friends noticed a bunch of red flags in Jodi and grew concerned about Travis's safety. As the relationship between Travis and Jodi became more and more violent and toxic. After 5 months of being together, Travis broke up with Jodi. And after a few weeks, she moved to Mesa where Alexander lived. Jodi began to show up at her ex-boyfriend's house unannounced and let herself in after unlocking the garage door. While this got Travis angry at times, the couple would sometimes become intimate. Meanwhile, Travis had already began dating another woman named Lisa. And occasionally, Jodi would try to scare Lisa by knocking on her door and running away. After living in Mesa for about 8 months, Jodi went to her family's home in California. However, Jodi and Travis kept in touch. In 2008, Alexander had planned to attend a company retreat in Mexico with a Mormon woman who he had started dating. He never went to the retreat and his friend did not hear from him again. After 5 days of no contact, his friends visited his house and found a horrific scene. As it turned out, on June 4th, 2008, Jodi and Alexander were at his house in Mesa. Jodi stabbed Travis 27 to 29 times. Travis's throat was slit along with a gunshot wound to his head. The medical examiner also revealed that he had defensive wounds on his hands. Travis died of blood loss at the age of 30. This was the photo Jodi took of Travis moments before she brutally murdered him. This case is just so brutal and unsettling, and may Travis Alexander rest in peace. This cartel execution video that I'm about to explain might be the worst one out there. Before I begin, never go searching for this video. The video begins and you see the victim lying on the ground on his back with his hands tied and his shirt pulled over his head. He's surrounded by 3 to 4 cartel members, and one of the cartel members takes out a wooden stick or a plank and begins hitting the victim's feet with it. The video then skips and it shows the aftermath. His feet have been hit so hard by this blunt object that you can see blood leaking through his socks, and all throughout this you hear the victim's muffles of pain. The video then jump cuts again and they take the shirt off the victim's head and stuff his mouth with a gag. And at this point is where it gets truly disturbing. One of the cartel members takes a small knife and starts slicing off the victim's left ear. The sounds at this point are actually horrible. You can hear the victim trying to scream, but because he's gagged, it sounds like he's just snoring. And once the ear has been severed, they place it in his gagged mouth. The camera then pans to the victim's face, and despite the poor quality, you can still see the pain and fear in the victim's face. The video then jump cuts again, and the torture is not over. You see the cartel members hook up a car battery with some jump cables, and they then take the jump cables and electrocute the victim. They start by shocking his chest. You see the sparks flying and you hear the victim letting out grunts of pain. They do this several times and also electrocute his face, which is just awful. The video then jump cuts again and it shows the cartel putting the victim out of his misery. They behead him with a small knife that was used to cut his ear off. The victim is already dead at this point because they show you halfway through the dismemberment process, but it still shows them hacking and slicing away. The video then jump cuts again and it shows that the beheading has been completed, and in the final moments of the video, they take the victim's head and balance it on his chest so that they can capture some photos on their phone. And after this, the video concludes. This video is extremely graphic and I don't recommend you go searching for it. I'm telling you right now, it's just not worth it. This is just another video showing how cruel the world is that we live in, and how evil humans can be to one another.
Charles Sabraj, aka the Serpent, is one of the world's most notorious criminals. Looking at him now in this picture, aged 79, you'd never think he'd be capable of such awful crimes. He's led a life of crime from a very young age, regularly robbing tourists, jewellery stores and even a bank. He was caught and arrested multiple times in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was imprisoned in places like Paris, New Delhi and Kabul, just to name a few. He earned the name the Serpent by being able to evade police and slip through the net. He dabbled in numerous petty crimes and schemes to fund his lavish lifestyle, before eventually turning to murder. Bodies soon started showing up in various locations. For example, Teresa Knowlton was found drowned in a tidal pool in the Gulf of Thailand. Vitaly Hakim's charred remains were found along a road to the Pattaya resort where Charles happened to be staying, and a couple of Dutch students were also found strangled and burned. Charles was an extremely intelligent criminal, and he'd pose as other people to gain the trust of unsuspecting tourists before poisoning them. He'd then rob them and take their passports and then travel from country to country using those passports while carrying on with his murder spree. Charles, now aged 79, strongly denies all the claims that he's a murderer despite all the evidence. It's actually really interesting to hear him talk about his version of events. This is Charles himself talking about the events that led to his arrest in 1976. He'd managed to convince a group of students to take medication to avoid dysentery. He had, in fact, poisoned them, just like his previous victims.
Bien, il y en a qui commencent à se sentir mal, ils se lèvent de leur chaise et ils tombent par terre. Et juste à côté de moi, la femme du chef de l'équipe, elle-même, elle dit « Oh, je me sens pas bien, je vais dans ma chambre », elle se lève, elle essaye de marcher, elle tombe par terre aussi.
That was a clip from The Serpent Conversations with a Killer. If you're a true crime fan, and I'm assuming you are if you're watching this, then it's an absolute must-watch. You can find it on the app Crime and Investigation Play, which can be downloaded from the App Store and Play Store in the UK. It's an absolute must-have app for true crime fans like me, and if you use my exclusive code, you'll get your first 3 months absolutely free. It's really easy to download, so all you need to do is go to Create Account and fill in your details. Select whichever plan you like, and then click on where it says promo code and enter CI Play Alex just as it's written. And you'll get 3 months completely free. I would absolutely love it if you'd go give it a watch and come back here and tell me what you think. This case has literally shocked me to the core. The fact that this can happen while you're just laid asleep in bed is just absolutely horrifying. Trigger warning, some of the details are extremely graphic. Kimberly Cates and her 11-year-old daughter Jamie were fast asleep on the night of October 2nd, 2009. They were completely unaware that 4 teenagers had broken into their house with knives and machetes, intent on murder. 19-year-old Stephen Spader, a high school dropout, had formed a club with 3 friends called the Disciples of Destruction. He'd told his friends Christopher, William, and Quinn that they had to be initiated into the club, and to do that, they had to join him in entering someone's house and killing everybody inside. They chose the Cates home at random, completely unaware that David was actually away on a business trip, and that Kimberly and Jamie were alone, asleep upstairs. They broke in through a small downstairs window and made their way upstairs with their machetes and knives. They found Kimberly and Jamie asleep in the bedroom and began their attack. Stephen and Christopher started raining down blows on both Kimberly and Jamie. Just a quick trigger warning again here because the next bit is pretty graphic. Kimberly was hit 32 times. Her skull was split open, her left eye socket destroyed, several organs were pierced, her bones were shattered, and her throat was slit. Despite her injuries, Kimberly shouted to her daughter, telling her everything was going to be okay, before finally succumbing to the massive blood loss and passing away. 11-year-old Jamie was struck 18 times. The blows severed part of her left foot, split her skull open, and shattered her jaw. Jamie actually played dead until the boys left, and then she struggled to the kitchen and dialed 911. Miraculously, she actually survived. The boys dumped their bloody clothes in a river after the attack and then went home to bed. But the next day, they went to a friend's house and started bragging about the attack. The friend's mum actually overheard part of the conversation and went to the police fearing that her son might be involved. All 4 teenage boys were soon arrested and their trials began. It was determined that Stephen top left and Christopher top right were the ones that had attacked Kimberly and Jamie. William, bottom right, had actually stood in the bedroom doorway and witnessed the attack, while Quinn Glover, bottom left, had waited in the living room. Stephen Spader showed absolutely no remorse over the killing of Kimberly. He did it for fun, and if it hadn't been Kimberly, it would have been someone else. He was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of Kimberly and 76 years for the attempted murder of Jamie. At Christopher Gribble's trial, he actually admitted that if he'd realised Jamie was still alive, he would have made sure she was dead. He also said that he was the one that slit Kimberly's throat. He was sentenced to life without parole. William Marks was sentenced to 30 to 60 years for being an accomplice to murder, and he'll be eligible for parole in 2039. Quinn Glover was sentenced to 20 to 40 years for burglary, robbery and conspiracy, and he'll be eligible for parole in 6 years' time. Jamie bravely appeared in court to see her attackers sentenced, accompanied by her father David. They now hold a golf tournament every year on the anniversary of Kimberly's death to raise money for the Kim Cates Scholarship Fund, which helps college students with their expenses.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there. This is Jared Fogle, one of the worst pedophiles in American history. So if you don't know who Jared Fogle was, he was the spokesperson for Subway for a number of years. Jared initially became famous and then eventually became the spokesman of Subway because he dropped so much weight while eating a Subway diet. According to Jared, he lost almost 245 pounds while eating almost exclusively from Subway. Obviously, this was a huge story, and when Subway heard about this, they contacted Jared and eventually made him the spokesman for their entire company. I swear to God, I remember this. For years, you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing this guy's face. So in 2004, when Jared was at the height of his popularity, he launched the Jared Foundation, a foundation determined to fight childhood obesity. This foundation saw Jared touring schools across the nation, talking to kids about losing weight, and yeah, just being heavily involved with children, which people at the time thought was a great thing. But it was when he was away from the cameras, behind the scenes, when Jared was engaging in some of the most deplorable behavior I've ever read about. So in 2007, a radio host and journalist from Florida came forward to the FBI and reported that Jared was saying and doing some concerning things. Apparently, while at a middle school event, Jared had been talking to her about performing lewd acts on a minor. He had texted her about all of these things, and she even recorded him saying all of this stuff. At one point, apparently, Jared even asked this journalist if she could install webcams in her children's bedrooms so he could watch them. Obviously, this was concerning. This journalist recorded all of this, turned it into the FBI, but they told her that they couldn't do anything because they didn't have enough evidence. And now we got to talk about Russell Taylor, a guy who was heavily involved in Jared's foundation. So when he wasn't working on the Children's Foundation, this guy, Russell Taylor, was producing CP in his home. Apparently, between the years 2011 and 2015, Russell Taylor had videotaped minors in his own home and traded photographs of them with none other than, you guessed it, Jared Fogle, king of the footlong. According to court documents, Jared actually asked Russell if he could move some of the nanny cams in his home so he could watch children in varying states of undress or while they were naked taking a bath. Russell also claimed that Jared made him set up accounts on porn sites in his name, and he wanted to basically run his whole CP operation for him. Well, shortly after Russell Taylor was arrested, Jared Fogle's home was raided, and guess what they found? A ton of CP. On the same day that his home was raided, Subway severed all ties with Jared, and some new disturbing facts came to light during the trial. Apparently, years prior, Jared had been texting a Subway franchisee named Cindy. And over these texts, he talked about wanting to abuse kids aged 9 to 16. He told Cindy she should sell herself for sex on Craigslist, and even asked her to arrange a sexual meetup between him and her 16-year-old cousin. Eventually, Jared pled guilty to possession of CP and traveling to conduct an illicit sexual behavior with a minor. Apparently, while in New York City, he paid to have sex with a 17-year-old girl. But this story isn't over yet. I'm going to post part 2, and it definitely gets more interesting from here on out. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, did not act alone. This TikTok series is about to blow your mind, but there's a lot of information here, so proceed with caution. The case of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer clown, is one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. A brief overview of the case: in the 1970s, John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men. He buried them in the crawl space beneath his home and his yard, and he was connected to a number of different crimes. Gacy himself gained infamy because he dressed up as Pogo the Clown on the weekends and volunteered at hospitals and children's birthday parties. Now, the official story says that John Wayne Gacy acted completely alone. He had no help in carrying out any of these murders, but I really don't believe that that's the case. Through all of our research that we did for our podcast, we've determined that Gacy was connected to a number of other killers, pedophiles across America. And he even may have been connected to one of America's other most infamous serial killers, the Candyman out of Houston, Texas. So before we get into this, I want to state that I do believe that Gacy did murder some people, and I think he was very complicit in all of this, obviously, but I don't think that he acted alone. But why do I think that? So to start off, we need to talk about Jeffrey Rignall, this guy who was actually a survivor of John Wayne Gacy. After a night of abuse and essay at the hands of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Rignall was allowed to go free. But what Jeffrey would go on to tell authorities and the media about what happened that night at Gacy's home is a major thing in this whole conspiracy. Now, Jeffrey would tell the police that while Gacy was essaying him, there was another man in the room. Now, whether or not this other man participated in the essaying or they were there to watch, it doesn't matter. Someone was watching this criminal act occur. He knew he could give a description of the guy, and he knew that someone else was there watching this happen. Then we get to Robert Bob Gilroy, who was a victim of John Wayne Gacy. So Robert Gilroy was abducted on September 15th, 1977. That's the official date that he went missing. He was supposed to show up for an event after that day, but he never showed. But John Wayne Gacy's plane tickets and records placed him as being out of the state at the time. His plane tickets from the time show that Gacy left Illinois on September 12th, and he didn't return until September 16th, the day after Robert Gilroy went missing. Already, these two facts point to a larger conspiracy at hand. There may have been people helping procure victims for Gacy, and he may have been even paying for these victims. And that's when we get to Philip Paskey and John David Norman, two of the most horrific people I've ever read about, and this is where the connections with the case start to get really shocking. And we've talked about John David Norman here on my TikTok before. This guy was connected with the higher-ups in the government. This guy had lots of political power, and he was a known pedophile. Remember, in earlier TikToks, I even told you about how John David Norman was arrested multiple times. He had Rolodexes full of index cards of the people who he was supplying these young men to. And both times, the police departments lost the Rolodexes and lost all the names of the abusers. But how did they connect to Gacy? Well, in part 2, we're going to talk about it.